I've seen a lot of debate online on what the next Westeros material that George R.R. Martin is going to publish will be. I've seen people say, oh, he's not going to publish anything else. I don't think that is true whatsoever. I think he's clearly writing and working hard on things. But regardless of that, I've seen some other people suggest that Blood and Fire, this second half of the Targaryen history, could end up being published before The Winds of Winter. The idea that this book, this history text, could be easier to write than the complex narrative with interweaving stories that is the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire. And there is some precedent for this idea. We see that Fire and Blood was originally intended to come after The Winds of Winter until in early 2018, George R.R. Martin decided that Fire and Blood was going to be published before The Winds of Winter because likely his publishers wanted to get something out while Game of Thrones was still actively airing before it ended in 2019. But I disagree with this new assertion that Blood and Fire would be easier for Martin to complete than The Winds of Winter. And today I want to examine why exactly I think that. I think it's first important to examine why exactly Fire and Blood was able to come together so quickly. And a big part of that is because a lot of material in that text was already written before the actual idea for this singular published volume of Targaryen history was kind of conceived. Because Martin had previously written several kind of short story additions to these anthologies. Specifically, we see Sons of the Dragon, The Rogue Prince, and The Princess and the Queen, all of those covering both the Dance of the Dragons, in the case of the latter two stories, and the Sons of the Dragon, which covers the later part of Aegon's reign, in addition to Aenys and Maegor's reigns. In between those parts of the text, that's about, I would say, half or maybe even a little more of Fire and Blood that was written before Fire and Blood was even a twinkle in Martin's eye. And beyond that, he did kind of more in-depth writing on Aegon the Conqueror's conquest of Westeros in the World of Ice and Fire as well. So that's an extra maybe 10 to 15% of the book that was not finalized necessarily. It did need to be tuned up and added to this kind of larger text and kind of added just some transitional material between there. But I would say around 60% of the book was written before the book was going to be a book. And I think in the present instance, people discount that The Winds of Winter is kind of at that point right now, where we do know that there has been so much material written over the years that he is very much further along on it than he would be on Blood and Fire. We know he's produced some pages on Blood and Fire. He mentioned that in 2024 at the end of the year blog post, and that is interesting that he has been writing it, and I do think it's probably good to switch back and forth between that and Winds, be able to kind of use one as a creative outlet when you might be stuck on the other. But I think that the fact that there is just so much more to cover in Blood and Fire than its predecessor, I think that will very much tilt the scales in Winds' favor in terms of being completed. Because we should take a look at exactly what is within Fire and Blood and what needs to be within Blood and Fire. In Fire and Blood, we see 7 Targaryen monarchs discussed over 130 years of Westerosi history. Those monarchs being, this is off the dome, hopefully I'm correct on all of them, Aegon the First, Aenys the First, Maegor the First, Jaehaerys the First, Viserys the First, Aegon the Second, and spoiler for House of the Dragon that I'm not going to say, being the 7th monarch. Beyond that, this is going to need to be quite more comprehensive if we're looking at what Blood and Fire needs to cover. It's going to be 10 Targaryen monarchs, so I'm not going to list right now. I'll get into that a little bit later. But additionally to that, there are 150 years of history as opposed to the 130 years of history. And I do think there's a fair bit less blank space in there, as 50 years of Fire and Blood is peaceful Jaehaerys reign, where very little actually happens in the way of massive events in the realm. When we're looking at Blood and Fire, the sequel, not only do we have more kings here, they're generally more eventful than the kings that came before them. We have several who, in Fire and Blood, really don't have many events or things notably going on in their reign. We have Jaehaerys, we have Viserys, where there are obviously like kind of the build-up elements of the Dance of the Dragons, Aenys to an extent, not much happens, as well as the later Aegon reign, really. And I'm not just saying nothing happens in terms of no wars going on, but just the realm is kind of at a stagnant state and things really aren't changing or progressing in a way that makes for kind of additions to a history book. If we're looking at the trajectory of the kings after them, though, we have that ruler right after the Dance of the Dragons, who is kind of static and peaceful. But after that, we have Daeron, who's going to war with everyone, Baelor and all of his religious reforms, Viserys II, who's a blip for a year, in fairness, Aegon the Unworthy, who I'm sure would be like hundreds of pages on his own just from all of the stuff he got up to, and all of the various mistresses and bastards, if I could speak. And then Daeron the Good, dealing with all the Blackfyre Rebellions, Aerys the First as well, getting into some of the Bloodraven stuff. Mykar also dealing with Blackfyre Rebellions. Aegon the Fifth obviously is going to get a lot of focus as this character that he's already been developing in the Dunk and Egg stories. Jaehaerys II has to deal with the War of the Nine Penny Kings, and obviously Aerys II has a bunch of this build up to Robert's Rebellion as well as his own descent into madness. So yeah, there was just a lot of events to cover in Blood and Fire as compared to Fire and Blood, which really just had Aegon's conquest, Maegor's wars, Dance of the Dragons. Not to interrupt my own train of thought, but I do want to ask what you think of all of this. Do you think I'm correct on any of this? Do you think Blood and Fire is going to be more difficult than Fire and Blood to write? Do you think it would take longer than the Winds of Winter? Do you think it will release before or after or during, and not at the same time? Probably not. But let me know in the comments while you're down there. Leave a like, subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I really appreciate it. I think the Blackfyre Rebellions are kind of a problem for Blood and Fire as well, as while they are super interesting, they are also just more Targaryen civil war, and there are so many of them that it seems as though it might get repetitive, and having to flesh out each of these conflicts seems like it would take a lot of page space as well. Granted, the Second Rebellion is just kind of an afternoon at a tournament, as is covered in another short story that I won't spoil for a show that'll come out in like 4 years' time. But regardless of that, there is just so much ground to cover there, and I think that it does kind of bear repeating at a point. And in addition to that, we have Robert's Rebellion, which is this really in-depth and fleshed out conflict. Well, the scale of these conflicts isn't quite as massive as the Conquest or as the Dance of the Dragons, as there aren't these massive fire-breathing nuclear weapons involved. There are still very human elements that I'm sure Martin has a very strong desire to flesh out. There are also more established characters involved in the story going forward. This is naturally going to be the case as it is closer to the series present, and I do think that having that kind of material from the main series will make Martin want to go more in depth. And it makes sense as the Maesters writing this book in universe, quote unquote, do have more material for all of these recent events to actually add to their kind of chronology of how Westeros is progressing, as it won't be kind of these fragmented sources that we have on the Dance of the Dragons, which was such a fun device to use as well. Additionally, I think that Aegon V's reign is going to be pretty tricky because he's going to want to walk a balance of informing us of what's going on in Dunk and Egg stories insofar as they are affecting the plot of Westeros as a whole and the wider political trajectory, but he won't want to spoil things for future Dunk and Egg stories as well, as there are certain events that need to remain shrouded in mystery, like Summerhall, for instance, and these things that maybe the historians don't have as much of a view on, but getting in Dunk's head will actually give us kind of the boots on the ground and actual perspective of what's going on in Westeros at this point. There's also the matter that these areas of history are a lot less fleshed out than the early stuff. We've seen Martin had to go back and flesh out certain areas of Fire and Blood, namely Aegon's reign, the parts of it that aren't war, Jaehaerys' reign, and then kind of refining the stuff in the Dance of the Dragons and then after the Dance of the Dragons. But beyond that, in Fire and Blood, there really isn't a ton. Obviously, we have stuff from Robert's Rebellion as the backbone of the entire series and how things start off there, but beyond that, I've always thought that some of the eras surrounding the later Blackfyre Rebellions especially 3 and 4, are very much shrouded in mystery, as Martin is trying to preserve surprises for not only the main series and Bloodraven and the influence he might have on the events of the core Song of Ice and Fire books, as he is still alive in the North and training Bran, but additionally, I don't think he wants to spoil his own stuff for Dunk and Egg, so he really hasn't fleshed out a lot. So where the World of Ice and Fire works as an outline for all of this this broadly. I think it is a lot more sparse in the areas that would need to be covered by Blood and Fire. And I think with so many more wars, more characters, more kings, more politics, Blood and Fire is necessarily going to be larger than Fire and Blood. This has been a tendency of Martin for one book to be larger than the next, save for A Feast for Crows, which is the exception that proves the rule. I do think that Blood and Fire, in terms of just being a text, is going to need to probably be at least 50% longer than Fire and Blood, just to cover all of the additional material that is contained within these eras, as not only is it more years, there's just more stuff going on generally, and I think that'll take even longer to write because of it. I do think that Blood and Fire is a very daunting project, more so than many people give it credit for. I don't think it's more difficult than The Winds of Winter. I don't think it will take longer than The Winds of Winter, but I think it will take longer than the current state of The Winds of Winter to get published. I think people very much kind of take him saying he wrote some pages on Blood and Fire as, oh, he must be almost done with Blood and Fire to mention that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. The reason we didn't hear about Fire and Blood until it was nearly published is because so much of it was already written. Martin, for Blood and Fire, is starting from effectively square one, so the addition of pages isn't that significant as it might have been in Fire and Blood or now to The Winds of Winter. So overall, it is unclear what the trajectory of these things may be, but we'll see. I might get completely proven wrong at some point in the near future, which I would love to see. Thank you all so much for watching. What do you think? Do you think Blood and Fire is going to be difficult, easy? I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see either way. Let me know in the comments down below. While you're down there, leave a like, subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it does really help the channel. I have many more videos for you on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, and Game of Thrones in the very near future, and I look forward to sharing all of those with you. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.